Welcome to Steve Nallon Ghost Stories. This episode, The Final Fake, a tale of lies and truth, but not necessarily in that order.
Years ago, I was going to do a show called Being Somebody Else about those people who take on alternative identities as part of their job or their life, sort of shapeshifters. And that included clairvoyants who take on the voices of the dead. It also included an elephant in Kenya who sort of impersonated the noise of trucks, that sort of low rumble. And you get that in the animal kingdom, you know, parrots and all the rest of it. But it did occur to me that clairvoyants were illusionists ultimately and fakes. And I thought it'd be interesting to come up with a story which tried to prove that clairvoyants were fakes, hence The Final Fake.
So we have the inspiration behind The Final Fake, but what's the story behind the story?
Well, it really goes back to all the research I did for the idea of being somebody else. And one guy I came up with was John Stonehouse. And now I won't go into the whole details of him, but I thought it'd be interesting to begin the story at his trial because I wanted the story to be as authentic as possible. So I did loads of research into how journalists speak. They use phrases like above the fold, and then there's references to Fleet Street and El Vinos. And I chose a journalist because it's set in the 70s, or the backstory is set in the 70s, and we just had all the president's men, and journalists were, you know, the center of that story. So I wrote the story and how the clairvoyants are exposed, and the journalist was going to publish this. Here was the problem, though. I finished the story and I reread it, and it was very much, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. It wasn't because. And one of the golden rules, really, of stories is that you should have causality. One thing causing another. And I didn't think the story worked. Because you can have and then, as long as at the end of the story you come up with some sort of linking and some sort of connection, but that just wasn't there. And then I had my little brainwave and came up with how it all did connect. The problem is we can't talk about that because that's the big twist of the story. So I've sort of set up something I can't really reveal. However, what we can talk about is, all I'll call it is the monster of the story. And what struck me about the monster is it's a very devouring monster. And in a lot of horror, you get the fear of being devoured. It's there in Dracula and the zombies. Interestingly, it's also there in fairy stories. Hansel and Gretel and Little Red Riding Hood. So you could say that it comes from a sort of atavistic human fear, you know, caveman fear of being eaten. But there's something else. Now, here I want to just backtrack to my own teenage years, which were weird in the sense that I read a lot of Freud because I was interested in comedy, and he'd written a book on comedy. And Freud's wit and its relationship to the unconscious. And that got me interested in dreams, which then led me on to a man called Ernest Jones, who'd written a really interesting thing called, in 1931, called On the Nightmare. And On the Nightmare and Freud's book on dreams were fascinated me. So Ernest Jones's theory, which is sort of Freudian, is that dreams, nightmares, are unconscious conflicts between wish fulfillment and repression. Let's not get into the whole psychoanalysis thing, except repression here is about infantile fears and oral fixation. We like putting things in our mouths, but equally, we're terrified of that which might eat us. and obviously tigers, eaters, and all the rest of it. But in Freud, the people that eat you are your mum and dad. And interestingly, many of the characters in fairy stories are mother figures. The witch in Hansel and Gretel, and the grandmother to a degree in Little Red Riding Hood. And I think it's interesting that the monsters in quite a lot of the Doctor Who stories, a lot of the monsters that eat you, I think one's played by Anne Reid, another by Maureen Lipman, they're women. They're sort of female figures. I think somebody could do a thesis on Russell T Davis's oral fixation. Anyway, and in my story, eating is the gross out scene. I think it's probably the most gross out scene in my entire collection. And I liked it. I loved writing it, and then I became very macabre and thought, what about the leftovers? What about the bits that can't be eaten, that drop on the floor? And then I came up with we've talked about this before, and that is supernatural creatures who control rats. And then I remembered Lord of the Flies, and sort of came up with the idea that flies come out of the monster's mouth and so eat the bits of leftovers that have fallen on the floor. And that's why in the book there's sort of little images of flies sort of all over the page.
So I wanted to ask you or discuss a little bit about the 70s media. So I've always been quite interested in stories that were set around that time, whether it was the Red Riding, whether it was how people have fixated on a story over time, whether someone's disappeared and the media just followed it, mainly because, we would get all of our information from the radio, the television, or newspaper, and that was it. So the stories sometimes would continue for decades, and we would find out a little bit more information, a little bit more. So I just kind of wanted to ask a little bit about the John Stonehouse trial, and why did that speak to you, say, more than some of the other things that were around at the time?
Well, it was a big story, and it was just so weird, because if you'd have presented the Stonehouse story to a fiction editor at Penguin or something, they just said no one's going to believe this. It was one of those things, and I think I talk about in the book, because it in the story is that it was really a case of truth being so much stranger than fiction. You couldn't have made Stonehouse up. The way he left his trunks and stuff and clothes on a beach in Miami, and everybody was meant to have assumed that he's been eaten by a shark, and it was just extraordinary. And the other thing about the newspapers in those days is that they were really, there was nothing else to do on a Sunday except read the Sunday newspapers, and there would be profiles about Stonehouse. And as I said, I wanted my little story to be as authentic as possible. So I wanted it grounded in a real story that was almost fictional, if that makes sense.
Yes, yeah, no.
Of the utter absurdity of it, partly because my story becomes so weird by the end, but I just really wanted it to sound as truthful as possible. And the media had great power in those days, and the journalist in my story, I don't make this absolutely clear, but essentially I think he's telling his story because he's dying, and right. he wants to reveal what really happened. But he became very famous as a writer, an expose of clairvoyance. And that was the case in the 70s. Journalists were really quite powerful people who wrote best-selling books. I mean, I'd find it difficult now to name a journalist who had written a powerful bestseller that had changed people's perceptions. Absolutely, there's the YouTube and internet and X and all that sort of stuff. But not so much in books and actual newspapers anymore.
Yeah, certain stories capture the imagination, don't they? For sure. Now I imagine a bit like it becomes sort of becomes a meme. I'm thinking of somebody like Raoul Moat or something like that, where people kind of strangely create humor around something very strange and tragic and horrible. Um, and I've noticed there's a real trend for a lot of books that kind of are half fiction, half fact, written as if they are reporting on it, but from different switching points of views. Maybe that's because we find it now harder to nobody really believes anything that they read, whereas in the 70s you'd read a newspaper article on somebody disappearing and go, oh, that's exactly what happened.
Stonehouse was a politician. He was. I think he'd been not a major cabinet minister, but he'd been in government. So it, it, the equivalent today would be I don't know, a cabinet minister going off to Miami and putting his kegs on the beach and going into the sea and suggesting he'd been eaten by a shark. You get no. That's not that. It was the incredibility of it that was we just couldn't. We couldn't believe what we were reading every day. We just couldn't believe it, and yet it was factually correct.
Yeah, yeah, like you say, it comes across if you read that as a work of fiction, like that's ridiculous. I found that with the the ITV show where about the guy who paddled off, and then his wife hid him in the locker. It was the Toby Jones series. I could not, and I think what you've managed to do is balance that without making it ridiculous. It's grounded in reality and engaging in a way that, and maybe I'm on the opposite side of to what other people thought about it critically, but just him being up in his loft and the way it was played couldn't help but be a bit silly. I found it a little bit silly, but I guess that's possible because really the situation is silly. Somebody pretends to disappear in order to get some insurance money or whatever, and the wife's feeding him the toast up in the loft. It's like something out of a lower low.
Without the Madonna with the big boobies, but that's another matter. I think the other thing I was trying to do with all the research I did, I mean, I don't put your research on the page, Mrs. Worthington, but I did a bit. But the research I did actually was quite useful in being a misdirection for what becomes the big reveal at the end. And had it just being those characters that we meet, and so I tried to put a lot of weird facts all around the journalist's various encounters that lead up to the climax.
That's probably what it is. Then you've built a world around it so it feels more it feels more real, and I think that's what I got out of it for sure.
And I sent it to a journalist friend of mine, Johnny Maitland, and I said, "Have I got the voice right?" And he loved it. He made the point. He said, "This reads like reality, even though it's got a monster with flies coming out of its mouth that does nasty things." But and it takes you a bit by surprise. I think does the ending, and nobody that has read it. Several people have picked up on twists that I put in and in other stories, and they say, "Well, I half guessed that was going to happen," but nobody has with this one. Well, as I said, the story involves a lot of eating. Food is there all the way through the story. It's not giving too much away. I think that the monster does a bit of eating. So this is the extract where it devours. The cavernous mouth takes in the naked doctor feet first, and the worms and maggots, now in their hundreds, fall upon him and eat his flesh, inch by inch, sinew by sinew. As they do,
Time itself seems to become complicit in the agony, for every scream appears to go on forever. When there is just the skeleton of his legs to see, 2 rows of sharp razor teeth like those of sharks grow from the monster's gums, and then snap together as would a bear trap. The sound of the cracking bones rattles round the rooms as her jaws crunch and gnaw with ravenous appetite upon the splinters. The cries of the naked man are shrieks of agony never heard on this earth before. And I hear them still at night in my dreams. And often in my waking hours, too.
You've fallen to pieces.
Isn't that why you came back?
I'd like you to kill me. You just have to.
So as the trailer just illustrated, the film pairing, possibly the strangest, but I feel like I say that every episode, one of the strangest pairings. This is a film known by many titles: Order of Death, Cop Killer. There's actually more than that, based upon the success of one of the stars later on. I'll kind of talk a little bit about that in a moment. This is the John Lydon and Harvey Keitel film, Order of Death, from 1983. I can't wait to talk about this with you, Steve, because again, it has so many titles, which I think, as we were talking earlier, is quite apt for this film. It's also known as Corrupt Lieutenant, which I find quite funny because obviously Bad Lieutenant was a big hit for Harvey Keitel, so they always like, well, let's call it Corrupt Lieutenant. And just, as we say, corrupt, so many different things. This was John Lydon's first acting performance, and what I love in this is there's much like in your story, I feel there's different ways of telling the story. Now, this is mainly in the film because of an Italian director who mainly films in Italy, in Italian, giallo history there, but it is half in New York. All the exteriors in New York, all the interior is in Italy. Some of our cast are dubbed into English, but the central relationship between Harvey Keitel's Fred, Lieutenant Fred O'Connor, he is a lieutenant, so I suppose we could call him Corrupt Lieutenant, and Leo Smith, John Lydon's sneering, well, he's always sneering, but sneering, spoilt, awkward character. Their relationship is just so at odds because they're just polar opposites of each other. It's insane. It is insane. I'm interested in why you think I chose it, if that makes sense. Or what were your?
Why?
What's your yeah? Why
was I?
Why?
Why? I liked it. I mean, you know, it's partly cult because it one of those films that was badly reviewed when it came out, but has developed a following, I think, since then. And it's a weird film. It's changing identities, like the title. You never quite know who's who, what's what. It's a mind game thing, and I really liked it, actually. And then it's sort of like one of those very convoluted tales, sort of film noirs, where you really can't follow the plot, but it doesn't really matter because that really it's about the relationships, as you say, between the characters ultimately. Yeah, there's
my
corrupt cops, and that was a very, that was very of its era, late 70s, early 80s. Loads of movies about corrupt cops and stuff.
Mm.
It's certainly got horror in it, and sort of enslavement and all sorts of weirdy stuff going on. But
Yeah,
you're right.
it really does.
The central two performances are very different acting styles, if you want to use the word acting. But I thought it was great, actually. I surprised
Oh,
myself by really liking it.
well, the thing as well, I don't know what this says about John Lydon's acting career, but he hasn't had a starring lead role as of 2025 since this film. Now, I don't know whether it's like you can't improve on that, or whether it was such a traumatic experience. He's just popped up in different things over the years in smaller parts. I also heard that this was filmed in 81. It took until 84 to come out.
Right.
It's all over the place in terms of the sort of the marketing of it, and there was issues with it becoming public domain in America briefly, so it was rushed out with different titles, hence all the different titles. And I believe now the original owners own it, and some of the better versions are more available. It's, for me, I think when you look at keywords in things, as we tend to get these days in reviews, we kind of look and we just scan and see, because there's so many films to choose from. And I found the keywords for this such a strange combination of the first game, bare-chested male bondage, gay subtext, policeman, which could be like PC-49 with a New York City, corrupt cop, cat and mouse, giallo, throat slit, mind games, missing person, spoiled rich kid. And I thought, where would you find a movie that has all of those keywords attached?
Well, it's a bit of a dog's dinner as a
Yes.
film. Yeah, I think you're right. But I think that's, as I sort of, Hollywood produced the same films week after week after week. You wouldn't get this made now, because somebody would want it all explaining or all done differently. And what's interesting now, with I've talked about this before, with the whole Robert McKee rules of this is how a story is told. Well, those rules didn't quite apply in 81, 84. And so you get these sort of just weird, unexplainable narratives that I'm not quite sure any of it really makes sense. But like the sort of giallo films, does it matter? Does it matter that it, and I don't think it does. You'd throw you'd throw half of Dario Argento away if you made it make logical sense. And
I'd rather be confused than bored.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm with you on that.
Yeah. It's funny that he plays like a spoiled rich kid in this, John Lydon, which is against type for his first film, sort of first lead role. But the music was originally going to be Public Image Limited. I think The Order of Death is a title of one of their songs, and that gets pushed aside when Ennio Morricone becomes available, and we get an Ennio Morricone soundtrack. So again, like you say, it is a dog's dinner, but it's a delightfully wild ride that you go with all the way. And I think that the torture side of it is definitely horror, definitely giallo, and I think that side of things is just like we say, we're at the tail end of the 70s. We had some real responses to Vietnam and some of the horrors in Vietnam in the late 70s. I Spit on Your Grave and films like that, which were really hard, because I think it's just people dealing with horrible trauma and seeing such terrible things. I think by the beginning of the 80s, we're moving more into, we've still got that corruption. We've still got the corruption of people that we should be able to trust. But there's still a little bit of nastiness there that is a hangover from that sort of era. And I think the nastiness of it is what made me go like, oh, wow, this is... And obviously the nastiness of... I don't want to insult you, but the nastiness of the final fake there's some of that nastiness there too.
No,
so that was one of the reasons I heard it.
No, you're absolutely right. And it's I found it weird writing the nasty, unpleasant stuff. Um, but as I said, there's a sort of enjoyment when you come up with the right word to describe how somebody is eating somebody and their bones are crushing in their mouths. It's quite fun, really. I've been reading this book, The Philosophy of Horror by Noel Carroll, and I think it's sort of the set text if you do horror at college or whatever. And he talks about the monster, and one of the monsters being a sort of crossbreed, what he calls a category mistake. I think the posh word would be interstitial. Is that the correct word? Something like that. Interstitial. And it's the violation of nature where you can't categorize it as one thing or the other. And I mean, classically, that's Lovecraft, the sort of Lovecraft monsters. But in a way, I think the point is that the conception behind the monster is in a way greater than the actual configuration of the monster. What I mean by that is that you can imagine a giant crab, but a man who had the claws of a crab in a way would be more frightening than just a giant crab. And it was interesting that you get the Freddy Kruegers, the extended claws and so on. And David Cronenberg entire career is based on category mistakes in a way, The Fly and all the rest of it. Anyway, so here we have a wonderful category mistake created by Scott, which is the smiling woman with the vagina dentata, because the theme of the piece really is eating and consuming, and the female with teeth, which is a castration fear and all the rest of it. And so when we were chatting about who the woman should be, I suggested my grandmother. And he said, no, who would play it if it was ever made into a television thing or a film? I said, well, ideally, Irene Handel or Dandy Nichols, both of whom are dead, but it's a ghost story, so what does it matter? And it is, Doris Stokes was a great personality figure in the 1970s, and really, it's a version of Doris Stokes, but with big devouring teeth.
So, Steve, what book have you chosen to go along with the final fake?
Well, it's the first book of Samuel in the Bible. And I went to a Jesuit school and I studied the Old Testament and Scripture. Anyway, in the first book of Samuel is about Saul, who was the first king of Israel. And interestingly, he got rid of all the wizards and necromancers and so on. But when he was about to fight the Philistines, he decided to consult a necromancer, and because he wanted to know how to defeat the people who'd come from Canaan. So he went to Endor, and it was bad news for him because Samuel the prophet was raised from the dead and said, oh, by the way, you're going to lose the battle tomorrow, you're going to die, and so are all your sons. But you can sort of see what sort of connection, because it's my story is a little bit about raising somebody from the dead.
My obscure but fascinating fact is based around the Witch of Endor, and I was really interested in digging a little bit more deeply, just for my kind of my interest was piqued. So I looked into how the Witch of Endor is a mysterious figure in biblical history, but the only time we really get that explicit character, we have warnings about forbidden practices in times of desperation, and we get these subtle hints at what not to do, obviously, like guidance related to the unknown. But I believe there's a reason why the Witch of Endor is only found in Samuel, and there isn't really anything else.
Well, I think the original way she was described is as a female master of the Uv, or the just OV, I think it is, and the Uv was the hole that was dug from which the ghost would turn up,
Right.
which happens in the book of Samuel. But what happened in the late 15th century was that the people who were in charge of the witch trials realized the word witch wasn't in the Bible. So they went into the Bible and thought, oh, there's this great story about this necromancer from Endor, little village. Couldn't we not call her the female master of the Uv, the female master of the ghost hole, but call her a witch instead? So it's one of those things where the word itself is not there in the Bible, but there's a way of translating it into witch. I mean, really, I think it's a bit of a cheat, but the people around
it is, isn't it? Yeah. Is it not a way of serving their own purposes as well and proving their own points?
But she's an interesting character, and I suppose I liked reading about it all those years ago, because it's a great story, because Saul gets rid of them all, gets rid of all the necromancers and all the rest of it, but when he needs their help, he disguises himself in a shawl and pretends to be somebody else, and then sort of she works out that he's not who he says he is, and as I said, Samuel turns up as a ghost and said, "You're going to die." So it's a great yarn.
Yeah.
Forget all the theological side of it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
the sort of Christian side of it, they didn't like it because the ghost was coming from the hole, which to in a Christian perspective is the what's below earth being representation of hell. Anyway, my obscure but interesting fact, bit more light-hearted to a degree, and that goes back to John Stonehouse, who was arrested in Australia, but he was only arrested because the Melbourne police thought he was Lord Lucan, who had also done a runner. So you got these two stories in the 70s. Lord Lucan was never found. But the Melbourne police knew about Lord Lucan. I don't think they knew about John Stonehouse, but they knew about Lord Lucan. So he was arrested on the basis of being Lord Lucan. So you got going back to your film choice. You've got constantly changing identities all the way through.
Well, that's wild.
The theme of today.
I wonder if because obviously Stonehouse got out of prison after a few years. I'm really interested. I can't imagine Lord Lucan would have had the same fate. So I'm glad that I bet he's glad that they found out that he was his actual real persona, rather than continuing down that path of him being Lord Lucan.
Well, absolutely, because he would have been arrested for murder, because that's what I'm guilty for running into the sea pretending to be eaten by a shark, but I didn't kill the nanny. The final fake. So, what's your thoughts? What's your takeaway on the final fake?
Well, this really suited me as a story. Because we've got a few different styles, we've got like we say, a few different identities. There's just enough for me to delve into and have what I call my side quests, where I then go onto the internet and find out more information about those people, which is always great. Which is very irritating if I'm watching a film. Somebody goes, "You're not watching it." I am. I'm just researching this person and what they did. So, in that sense, I got so much out of the story. I know we've mentioned about the film, and I feel like it kind of solidifies how both of those go together, because for me, I need a lot of things to stimulate me, to kind of get me really engrossed into a story. So I think that I my final takeaway is that this might be one of possibly my favorite, or one of my favorites in the collection. And although most people would probably think Finding Hattie would be my favorite, because of my love for British comedy and for all things Carry On, but this one I think just appealed to the what I would say is my ADHD brain, and it gave me so many avenues to explore. So I just want to thank you for that, really. But what were your thoughts on what's your take on the fake?
Well, in a way, mine's a bit more theological, in that we've talked a lot about eating and devouring and being frightening. But for me, the real frightening part of the story, without revealing too much, is the concept of hell being absence, the concept of hell being a complete emptiness. I mean, Sartre said that hell was other people. But in a way, I think hell would be the absence of other people. And you get this, again, it's my Jesuit background, that we weren't taught that hell was fire and damnation. We were presented with the concept that hell is to see the face of God and then have that removed for eternity. To know that there is this great beauty, the most beautiful thing that can ever exist, and then be denied it. And that sense of denial and emptiness being what hell is to me what's the most frightening aspect of the story. The Strange Case of the Unaccountable Shadow. About a boy who's studying this book at school, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But in our story, it's an unaccountable shadow.